Hey friends, I know that so many of you listening to this are carrying a heavy weight of pain and loss. When we start to process what's happened in our lives, we often find ourselves paralyzed by the pain and not really knowing where to go from here. We even begin to hear or tell ourselves lies like, this is the end of our story, this will define you. And trust me, I've been there. But with the help of others, I was able to navigate my way out of that valley. And at Nothing is Wasted, we exist to help you navigate your pain and even find purpose in that pain. So if you are new to our community and wondering where to start, or if you've been with us for some time and you're just looking to take the next step, we're hosting a free live call just for you. In it, we're going to talk about 5 steps to taking back your story, no matter what you've gone through. In this call, our founder, Davey will share more of his story, and he's going to teach you 5 critical steps you'll have to take to rewrite your own story. This call is 60 minutes long, but I promise you it will be well worth your time, because in it you will learn how to regain a sense of agency and begin thriving, not just surviving in the midst of trying circumstances. Why having more questions than answers may be an essential part of moving forward. How to get rid of the overwhelming negative emotions that tend to bog you down and get you stuck. The one keystone decision that will help you get out of your pain. How to listen to the right voices when everyone seems to have an opinion on what you should do next, and a ton more. If you are feeling weighed down or paralyzed by the pain you've experienced, you don't have to stay there. And Davey will be your guide and show you the way back to thriving. Go to nothingiswasted.com/start here to sign up for this free live call, or if you're listening on Apple Podcasts, just click the link in the show notes. We've made it extremely easy to sign up, and we're offering multiple dates and time options for you for this live call to work with your calendar. I believe this one step could be the very breakthrough you need to put you on the redemptive path God has for you. Open the browser on your phone right now and go to nothingiswasted.com/start here, or just click the link we've included in the show notes of this episode. We are in your corner, and we can't wait to connect with you soon.
Hello and welcome to the Nothing is Wasted podcast. I'm one of your hosts, Davey Blackburn. And joining me, we have a guest host, Amy Sylvester. Amy, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. Excited to be here with you.
Yeah, Amy, you were featured on episode, do you remember what episode that was off the top of your head?
Yeah, it was 175.
Episode 175.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons that you know exactly what episode it was off the top of your head is not just because you were a guest and because you're like, oh, that was a very special moment, but because you're on staff with us and
Yes.
You carry so many different roles. You were probably the one editing your own episode. If that's a joke, but you were at least probably doing something along with your episode. You came on staff shortly after that episode.
I did.
Tell us a little bit about, just so our community, many people are going to know who you are, but so that everyone can be caught up to speed as to what you do, who you are.
Yeah, I'm so excited to be here, Davey, because I love being on this team, but really my entry point to Nothing is Wasted was the podcast. And if you did miss that episode, I talk about my son Hudson, and he passed away in 2016, and I got to tell much of his story with Aubrey, and I just love the podcast so much. I love everything that we do as a ministry. We have coaching and the Pain to Purpose course, and we're going to talk about a few other things that we're doing right now as a ministry. But the kind of open door for me was the podcast, and it was my first steps into the ministry before coming on staff, and then also I was listening, like binging these episodes because I was looking for stories of people who could survive really hard things. So it was a great place for me to be welcomed in.
Well, we find that that's the podcast is the open door for so many people. Some of you guys who are listening to this. This is how you first got turned on to the ministry of Nothing Is Wasted. Some of you didn't even realize it was a full-fledged ministry. There's so many other things that are going on in the underbelly of Nothing Is Wasted Ministries besides what you see out there or what you're listening to right here, watching on YouTube. And in fact, one of the other open doors or kind of front doors, I guess I should say, that people are introduced to our ministry through is through Pain to Purpose, especially at a local church level, which is something you're doing a whole lot of work with right now. Tell us a little bit about some of the stuff that you're doing with Nothing Is Wasted Ministries, Pain to Purpose, local church level, facilitators of the course, all that sort of deal.
Well, if you're not familiar, the Pain to Purpose course is an online course that you can do, or you can do it in your local church. And it's video based, and you get your own like notebook, participant guide that you kind of walk through your own journey towards purpose. And so I've stepped further into a support role there with some of our churches who are offering it as part of their kind of flow and their education of their community. And so I'm working with Ken Roberts, our church director here at Nothing is Wasted, and we've been spending time this past summer and even into the fall getting to know more of our facilitators, equipping them, training them, getting them ready. And a lot of the folks we worked with over the summer launched their course at their churches this fall, and we are getting updates that to me, it's like all the behind the scenes stuff that it takes to pull something like this off. When I get to do that touch point with someone, I hear the stories of, I lost my husband 3 months ago, and now I'm like linked up with other widows, or like those things to me push me to go do the behind the scenes, because I'm seeing God at work and people not staying stuck and alone. So that's,
Right. And what some people may or may not know, if anybody at this point in our ministry, if anybody writes an email in, or if it's usually you who is responding to that, and so you, ironically, we're talking about these front doors. You kind of we think of Amy as like the greeter at the front door in a lot of ways. To Nothing is Wasted Ministries, you're kind of letting people in the front door, and you just have such a welcoming presence about you that is so considerate forward toward other people. You're always caring about other people and how they're feeling and how they're doing and how they're feeling, And so you've just got this incredible way about you. I remember watching you at ARC and being like, oh my gosh. We went to the ARC conference, and you're there ministering to so many people who had experienced difficult things. You're there with pastors and church leaders, and they're coming and sharing their difficult stories with us, and you're praying with them. And it was just such a cool picture to see you praying over some of these folks who are experiencing difficult things. So you just have such a pure heart for ministry, and I love that.
Thank you, Davey.
Love having you a part of the team. Aubrey is super busy right now with the new release of her book, Big Feelings Day. And so Amy has graciously accepted the invitation to come and join us for the next couple of, hosting these next couple of episodes. Yes. And so we've got a great guest today. His name's Edward Grinnan. And before we dive into that conversation, there's a few things that I want to make sure that you know about. The first thing is this: if there is anything that really has ministered to you, Nothing is Wasted Ministries, if you're trying to figure out how to take a next step or take a first step toward healing, we have a Zoom call that I normally teach live. It's very rarely do we have to show some kind of a recording. Every once in a while we have to, but I normally teach this live. Try to carve time out of my schedule to make sure that we're spending time with you guys live via Zoom. So it's not a webinar. It's not like, oh, I see your face or you see my face, but we don't see. There's an actual interaction component, which I love, because at the end of some of the teaching time of this Zoom call, we take questions, and there's usually some really incredible times of healing and breakthrough in ministry right there that the Lord does with all of us. And so I want to invite you to that call. It's called 5 Steps to Taking Back Your Story. No matter what you've gone through, you can go to nothingiswasted.com/start here to register for the next one. Nothingiswasted.com/start here. And for those of you guys who have friends or family members who are walking through tough things, and you're trying to introduce them to, or warm them up to the idea that they can go from pain to purpose, this is a great next step for them. So invite them, maybe attend with them. Nothingiswasted.com/start here. As we speak right now, Amy, we are getting ready for a big thing this week.
Yes.
At the time that you're listening to this, it will have already happened, but we've got one of our pastor roundtable. We call it the Healing Leader Roundtable. So pastors, church leaders, leaders in the community. We've invited folks in the Lynchburg, Virginia community in partnership with Waymaker Church to come and join us. And we're really excited about that. That's going on this Thursday, November 2nd. And it's also my birthday, so it's like the best way that I could be spending my birthday is hanging out with you guys and ministering to a bunch of church leaders.
It's going to be awesome, Davey. Like, as we've talked about as a ministry, just how the churches are so we want the church to be where we turn when we're hurting. Like, we as a ministry want to come alongside churches to build up the church to where, it's a safe place, a healthy place, and equip our leaders to deal with their own pain and then to
Yep.
help communities. So I'm so excited. We had another one of these in Delaware with United, and it was so awesome. So I'm excited to be with you and the whole team this week.
I know. And we're planning several of these for 2024. We will, as soon as we possibly have all of those dates and those locations nailed down, we'll let you know, because I'm sure
Yeah.
that as many listeners as we have all over the country, that there will probably be one close to you.
Yeah.
And we'd love for you to invite your pastor, your church leaders, people in your community, maybe of counseling centers or wherever, or we'd love for you to come.
Yeah.
And so it's going to be a great event. I can't wait. We'll make sure you keep you updated on that. Today's conversation with Edward Grinnan. Edward was a fascinating conversation. Many of you guys may not be familiar with who he is, but chances are the work that he has done has impacted you, because Edward's the editor-in-chief and vice president of Guideposts Publications, the infamous Guidepost magazine. He is the editor-in-chief of that. He's served there for over 24 years now. And he's written several phenomenal books. One is called A Journey of Faith that just released in September. And it's kind of a memoir about his journey as he was navigating his mom's battle with Alzheimer's.
Yeah.
And then his own wrestlings of that. So we dive into that in this conversation. It really is it's a very, I would say, sobering conversation. So I was listening to him, and he's kind of reflecting back. Some of these conversations, you've got people who are talking very much about the present. Some people are thinking forward, and he's reflecting back on some things here. And it was very enlightening for me as he did that. So I want you to go ahead and lean in and take a listen to this conversation with Edward Grinnan, and we're going to be back with you, Amy and I will, and we'll have some conversation surrounding that conversation.
Davey, I just want to mention too, this episode will hit a lot of us because it talks about multiple pain points. It talks about his mom for sure, and her journey with Alzheimer's, and that may be part of what you're walking through. But also he talks about his journey with addiction, and then just also he there's suicide in his story. So just to let everyone know, it hits multiple pain points.
That's right. Let's go ahead and take a listen to my conversation with Edward Grinnan. Well, Edward, it's so great to have you on the Nothing is Wasted podcast. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks, Davey. It's a pleasure to be here, and I look forward to our conversation.
I do too, and I was explaining to you off air, the reason I'm looking forward to this is I think that the Lord does this kind of stuff a lot, where he just brings certain conversations in at a very timely manner. The folks who are listening to this, they're going to hear this kind of on repeat in some ways, but we do a call every other week called the 5 Steps to Taking Back Your Story, no matter what you're going through. And just this past week on that call, I had someone who was on that call who has just experienced a diagnosis at 42 years old of early onset Alzheimer's, and she was asking if we have any resources for it. I said, we don't right now. And then I get here this morning, and I sit down and I look at my notes for the interview that I'm about to do, and here you are, Edward. And I think it's just like the Lord for a time such as this, and I know that not just one person's going to be impacted by this conversation, but I know so many people are, because of your journey. And so I'm excited to be able to share your journey with our community. Why don't you tell us a little bit about who you are, where you live, what life is like right now, and then we'll dive into some of the journey that you've been going on.
Well, thanks, Davey. I always say, pertaining to that phone call you got, I always say that every day I trip over the Lord. In so far as I think I'm walking my normal path, and all of a sudden there's a little bit of a stumble, and I realize I'm being reminded that there's more than I'm necessarily expecting of the day. And so that phone call of yours was interesting, because it certainly, because I've just finished a book, my third, actually, memoir, called A Journey of Faith, A Mother's Alzheimer's, A Son's Love, and His Search for Answers. And I'm the editor-in-chief of a magazine called Guideposts that has been around since 1945. It's one of the beloved magazines, yes, of Americans. And it was founded by Dr. Norman Vincent Peale, the author of The Power of Positive Thinking. He actually founded Guidepost magazine about 8 years before he released that, groundbreaking book that really told people that the true secret to life is faith in oneself and faith in God. And that's what Guidepost magazine does by telling personal stories of people. People in the publishing industry in New York City, where I've spent half my time and worked there. They're like, "Oh, you're the editor of that magazine about God," and I cringe a little at their cynicism, I guess,
Yeah.
but it's really, I always say it's not really a magazine about God. It's a magazine about people who have faith.
That's
But
right.
the magazine is really about the people. Um,
Wow.
a magazine about God, that's not really what we do. We like to show people experiencing their faith in their day-to-day lives and putting their faith into action in various situations, many of which are the type of situations that you discuss. People who have reached some sort of juncture in their life when their faith is really being challenged, their strength is being challenged, and they find a way through that dilemma or that crisis, sometimes because the only thing left is their faith to get them through. So that's really what Guidepost Magazine. I've been doing that since 1986. Believe it or not, when I was hired as an assistant editor, and we can get into this later, but I was actually a down and out alcoholic at the time. I really was virtually homeless, and I'd never heard of Guideposts. And through some miracle, they got a hold of my resume. I have no idea. I didn't send it to them, and I never did solve that mystery of how they got my name, and they called me up, and I thought, these people don't know what they're getting into, having me come in for an interview. I wouldn't have hired me. At first I didn't even know what it was. I thought Guideposts was I thought it was a travel magazine. And I
Yeah.
thought, so maybe get some
That
free
sounds
trips
like a
out
travel
of this.
magazine or a
Yeah.
Western
Yeah, so I'll
Outdoors magazine
yeah,
or something.
yeah, like I could get some fun out of this. But if you substitute the word journey for travel, then that's what Guideposts has been to me, and
Wow.
it's a journey of faith that I have traveled, and I really discovered and deepened my faith working at Guideposts, because I was not a terribly faithful person when I got there, but I had a writing background that they needed, and I thought I'd stay for a year. And I said, okay, I'll work on my resume, and I'll join the rest of the publishing industry or something. And after the end of a year, I thought, I'll try another year. And that was in 1986. And I've been there ever since. I was named
That's almost
editor-in-chief
40
in
years ago.
19... I know. Don't remind me.
Wow.
And
Wow.
I was named editor-in-chief and vice president in 1999. And I'm
Man.
there because the people who read the magazine and the people of faith, the faith community in general in America, are so enriching, and you know this because you have a podcast and
Yeah.
an audience. The amount of power and strength and vitality that a faithful audience gives you is unbelievable. I would wonder how I could have made it through some of the issues of my life without that audience to connect with. So,
Wow.
um,
Wow. It's amazing.
so to
Isn't it so true?
that,
We talk a lot about, Edward. We talk about how Revelation 12 says that we overcome by the blood of the Lamb and the word of our testimony. And I love the fact that that's what Guideposts. I mean, what a career! What an amazing career you've had as the editor in chief there. I don't know how long you've been the editor in chief, but for 40 years being there at Guideposts and supporting
right,
this vision of saying, okay, we're going to share people's stories because that provides encouragement. It helps people who are like, I don't know if I can go on another day. It helps point them to, first of all, to the Lord, but then also to the purpose that God has given them and imbued inside of their life to be able to get up the next day. And
right.
I think it's so valuable and important. There's so many people who are creating platforms for their own story, which is not a bad thing, but I love the fact that you have pushed other people's stories to the forefront over the past several decades and said, this is a collection of all of us and how the Lord is showing up in all of our lives. It's amazing.
Right. That's so interesting that you bring that up because it wasn't until 2010 that I wrote my first book for Guideposts, A Promise of Hope, which should have told the story that I just encapsulated here. And it it was funny that it took me that long to tell my own story, and it was my wife at the time, my late wife, Julie, who said, when I agreed to write a book for Guideposts, she said, you should write about your own story and stop worrying about other people's stories for a while and just tell your own story because, you've never done that. And she was right. I hadn't done
Yeah.
that. I hadn't stepped out.
Yep.
Because when you tell your story and when you own your story, and we all have stories, every single one of us, our lives are the stories are the roadmap through life that we have. But we really reveal ourselves if we do it honestly. And that's what Julie said to me at the time: be honest. If you're honest, it will come out. You will be supported. God will be behind you on this project. So, and that was
Yeah.
what,
Wow.
3 books ago. And and that's what I thought
Wow.
about when I thought about writing this third book that's just been released through Guideposts. I thought about, okay, so what worries me? Who am I? What has
Mm.
shaped me? Where's my faith intersected with my life in a dramatic or a meaningful way? And it was
Mm.
the story of my mother's Alzheimer's, and seeing her through that painful process as a son and as a sibling to my brother and sister, what we had to do. And in my family, Alzheimer's runs in my family.
Mm.
And I worry about the state of my own mind. Even now, I find myself becoming more forgetful and sort of struggling with certain cognitive issues. So I've explored that in the book.
Mm.
But I've also explored, like, how does faith come into that? If you, I think the world's divided into people who want to know the future and
Mm.
people who don't want to know the future.
Mm.
And wanting to know, I think, is what makes us human. Wanting to know who we are, wanting to know our future, wanting to know God, and wanting to know and love God. Those
Yeah.
are the forces that propel us on a
Yeah.
journey of faith. And I wanted to know, so I went on a quest to find out what the state of my mind is right now. And some of the answers are still up in the air. But it was a fascinating journey to really think that you might want to know, what's ahead for you in the future.
Mm.
But what I learned is the only thing you can be certain of about the future is God is there. God is there waiting.
Mm.
God
Wow.
is he exists outside of the constraints of human time. He is in the past, he is in the present, and he's in the future simultaneously. And that's the one thing
Mm.
we know about tomorrow and next year and next decade and however far we can look into the future. The only thing we can really see with clarity is God's presence and God's love. And that's one of
Wow.
the things I
Wow.
discovered in this
So
book.
good.
Um,
So good.
so
Mm.
I to just
Edward,
to jump
I'd love
back a
for you to
little bit.
share.
Just to
Yeah.
jump back a
Yeah.
little bit,
Go ahead.
I'm worried about the woman who called you about Alzheimer's a little bit.
Mm.
I think you said she was diagnosed with early onset Alzheimer's. I think she said she was in
Mm.
her 40s. It's very young, but
40s.
it
Yeah.
does hit
42.
then.
Yeah.
Right. Um, Alzheimer's is a disease that really is shaking the foundation of our society. There are millions and millions of families who are affected by Alzheimer's one way or the other. Either they're caregivers or they have loved ones who are suffering.
Mm.
And it is an intractable, fatal disease. No one's ever survived Alzheimer's. The early onset that you described from this caller is really a hard, hard road. Um,
Mm.
and there's the support she can turn to her family and to her congregation and to her faith community. But also the Alzheimer's Association is a tremendous organization, and they offer a lot of resources. And I would urge anyone who's dealing with this, either themselves or with a family member, to check the Alzheimer's Association website for
Mm.
resources, because they are there, and it takes a tremendous amount of support. It's interesting about Alzheimer's. What could be crueler than a disease that steals our memories? A
Yeah.
disease that actually erases us. Um, and it is the disease that people over 50 fear most of contracting or coming down
Mm.
with, even though heart disease and cancer and other conditions afflict and kill more people than Alzheimer's. Alzheimer's is still that greatest fear of people over 50. And it's for people over 21, it's the third biggest fear. So
Wow.
the specter of that disease haunts us. And it has haunted me personally after watching my mother and all her siblings go through it, and thinking, where does that leave me, and where does that leave my faith?
Wow. Wow. Tell me a little bit about your mom and your relationship with your mom, if you will, and then share a little
Well,
bit about that journey as you're watching her having to suffer through this, and where was God showing up in that for you? Because you said it yourself,
well,
this is a cruel disease, and it'd be very easy for us to take that this reality of a cruel disease and begin to superimpose it onto God and begin to project that to say, okay, he must be a cruel God.
yes.
But tell me a little bit about your mom, that journey, and where God was showing up in it.
Right. Just to follow up on that one point about being a cruel God, I think it's really difficult. I can't imagine anybody not getting mad at God at some point in their life or another.
Right.
Just because we are humans, and
That's right.
we want to blame someone, and an all-knowing, all-loving deity is an easy target for our small minds. So yes, I certainly still do sometimes say, God, how can you allow this? But that's the essence of faith, is that you don't always understand, but you accept.
Yeah.
My mother, her maiden name was Estelle Rossiter. She was born in Philadelphia. She was a piece of work. Mom was a ball of energy. She was really smart. She was the daughter of a school teacher. She learned to read by the time she got into kindergarten practically, and skipped a couple grades, and was in college by the time she was 16. And by the 1950s, she was a quiz show champion. She really had a vast, active mind. She always had a couple books going. She read several newspapers a day. Our house was full of newspapers. I can't tell you how many newspapers we subscribed to. I mean, she was just so vibrant. And she was just dedicated to her church. She did a lot of service at St. Owen's Church in Birmingham, Michigan. And that's where some of the first evidence of her failing mind emerged. A nun, Sister Carolyn, got in touch with my brother and sister. I live out east. They're back in Michigan. And I'm out in New York and western Massachusetts, where I am now. And Sister Carolyn said, your mother's having trouble counting the collection plate. Now, my mother would take the collection basket after daily Mass, and she'd count out the take, and then she'd fill out a slip and take it to the bank and deposit it into the church account. And Sister Carolyn noticed that my mother was miscounting the collection every day, and it was a problem. And my mom was good at math, and she had done this forever, so we saw that. Sister Carolyn, was able to correct it for her in a subtle way, so my mom didn't realize that she was making these mistakes. She was also the church librarian, and Sister Carolyn got in touch with us and said, she's not shelving books right. That we're going to have to take that job away from her. She can still, check books in and out. And it was those little moments, and what comes into play is denial. And we're not my brother and sister and I are not dumb people, and my brother and sister-in-law and sister are certainly not dumb people. But that denial, that sense that, no, this isn't really happening, these are just the vagaries of an aging brain, and your mother's getting older, and you have to accept that she's got some limitations. But we really had trouble understanding that the likely cause of her memory problems was Alzheimer's, and that was going to consume her over the following years. And being a caregiver, me at a distance, which means I wasn't a very good caregiver, it really brought up a lot of anxiety, a lot of guilt on my part. And anxiety and guilt, in many ways are very selfish. And I was feeling more pain about myself, I think, than really about my mother, because I just felt like I should do more, I should be there, I should, she's loved me all my life, and I should be there for her now. And it really threw me. We're going to get into another part of my story, and I think I mentioned when I first came to Guideposts, I was practically dead of drug and alcohol addiction, and practically homeless at the time. And I had been, I had lived somewhat on the streets before I came to Guideposts. I would hustle change downtown Manhattan, around Wall Street, or over in Hoboken, in the Hoboken train station. I would really hustle change so I could keep drinking. I'd pick up cigarette butts off the street and smoke them. I mean, that's where I was before I came to Guideposts. So, and I got, one of the things I did at Guideposts was I got sober, through a 12-step program, and through a power greater than myself, a day at a time, which I still adhere to. And that, in the book I talk about how I slipped back into alcoholism during my mother's illness, during the early part of it. And I was in intense denial about it, intense denial that it had anything to do with my mother. I just said, I'm an alcoholic, and I'm drank because I drink. And I was in a detox, and I talked to a counselor who said, this has to do with the pain you're feeling about your mother. It's not an excuse for your drinking, but we all have triggers that trigger bad behavior, even sinful behavior. And I was denying that my mother's suffering was the trigger, that it meant I was having trouble coping with those emotions. And I was having trouble turning those emotions over to God and saying, Lord, take this from me. I was hanging on to it. It was poisoning me, and I was drinking again. Fortunately, I went back to 12-step, and I was able to right the ship. So I've been sober now for 27 years.
Wow.
But that period of time in my mother's Alzheimer's, when I began to drink again and began to suffer all the emotional and spiritual decay that comes from that, it told me how vulnerable I was and how much I needed, my faith to live a day at a time, and not just with my drinking, but with my mother's illness and with my own fears that when I saw her in decline, I began thinking, is that going to happen to me? It's a terrible thought when somebody else is suffering and you worry about yourself. But I did, and I had to accept that. I had to own that. Because I'm a human being, and not all my emotions are good ones, and not all my feelings are noble, but they're there, they're me, they're real, it's how God has made me. How can I, hate that? So I stopped hating myself.
Wow, man. Well, earlier you said that your late wife prompted you to be honest with your first book, and I really appreciate your honesty. Because all of us, when we encounter our own suffering, but also suffering of people who are around us, we have mixed feelings. We have feelings about their suffering that are noble and altruistic, and then we have feelings about our own and our own fears that, as you've just, very, very honestly and humbly said, hey, I felt like that was a noble emotion for me to have, and yet I had to be very transparent about that and put that out in front and go, this is something I'm experiencing. And I say that because I want people to recognize that for themselves. I think often those are the kinds of feelings that we can suppress and stuff, and that can lead and contribute to further adaptive coping mechanisms, really maladaptive behavior that could take place in our lives because of that. And it's really important for us to experience all of those emotions, really bring those very difficult questions to the forefront, and then place them at the feet of Jesus and wrestle with those. And I'm curious, Edward, what those questions were for you. We talk about philosophical, existential questions that pain tends to draw out of us. What were some of those for you as you were wrestling through some of this?
That's a great question, Davey. And what you say about maladaptive survival mechanisms, I guess, so many of us, even you come from a troubled family, and there was trauma in my family. I had a Down syndrome brother who was 3 years older than me, and when I was 9 and he was 12, he disappeared. He literally walked off the face of the earth. This was a wonderful, sweet boy.
Wow.
And he just went out for a walk before he was going to go to school, to a Catholic special education school. And we never saw him again. And it was, you can imagine, not just losing a child, but losing a special needs child, what it did to my parents. Their faith kept their marriage together and strong. But it was a terrible challenge. His body was found a month later, but there was never a really clear explanation of how he died. So, what I'm bringing this up because sometimes in our families, to survive our families, we develop survival mechanisms that work growing up, but are just blow up in our faces when we get into the real world as adults, because we're still clinging to those same, adaptations to a difficult situation. And I see it all the time in people, and I see it in myself, as well. And so some of the things, you were saying what I wrestle with often, am I a worthy person? I'm a good person. I question my behavior. Even what you might think of as a good behavior, I'll say, man, did I really do that because I'm a good person? Because I wanted to please someone, or I wanted to make myself feel better? One of the things I tell writers, I've been a writer and an editor all my life. And one thing I've learned, and which I try to tell writers, and also anybody who's trying to tell their story, is stop being so polite. I see so much polite writing. And I have to say, I see it mostly in Christian writers. They're too polite. They're too worried about revealing something that they'll be judged for. They'll be judged by God, but that's a different ballgame than worrying about what your readers and your audience and who you're sharing that story with. I learned that being honest is one of the most appreciated elements of any kind of writing or storytelling or sharing. When you're honest, people respond to it. And it took me a while. I was afraid to be honest. I didn't want to show who I was. Even when after 20 years at Guideposts, I didn't want to tell them who I was when I got to Guideposts. I didn't want to tell those struggles. I was afraid that that I'd be rejected, or they'd say, how did a character like this get in charge of this huge magazine? And what I learned is that when I was honest, like I'm trying to be with you about my feelings and who I am, that the acceptance was unbelievable. I mean, this is a faith-based, mostly Christian audience, so that's what I should expect of them, but I didn't. That idea of trust, comes in and out of my stories, particularly with my mother. Trusting that in one way or another she is in God's hands, trusting that we are all in God's hands, trusting that there isn't a situation that I won't be able to handle, even if handling it takes all of me to do it. That one of the great lessons I learned in my mother's journey, and even in my own struggles now, with my possible issues, is that trust has to travel with you. If you can't ask questions of yourself or God that you are unwilling to trust the answers. And that trust, people have issues with trust naturally. I think we are all programmed in a way to think twice before we trust in anything. And sometimes you think a lot more than twice, and you never do it. Trusting is a leap of faith. Faith is a question of trust. And it is really the foundation of our relationship with a higher power, is the ability to trust something outside ourselves. I found when I trusted myself, things always went awry.
Wow.
So.
Wow. It's interesting how it feels like in our journey with the Lord, trust is always at the juncture with him. It's almost every single circumstance that we encounter, every single decision that we have, it's almost a trust decision. It's okay, am I going to do this my way? Am I going to take on like a more self-preservation type decision, or am I going to take on a self-sacrifice decision right here and trust God's ways with this? And it seems to there seems to be these trust tests along the way where God's going, okay, which direction are you going to take?
Well, you talked about the trauma in your life, what happened to your wife and unborn child.
Yeah.
And those are the situations. Because when you come out, when I lost my brother, or when I was down and out as an alcoholic on the streets of New York, or you at the end of that part of your journey, can you trust again in the Lord? Like, for you to be able to trust God after trusting Him and then seeing what happens, that what can happen in a life, what tragedy and sadness that can visit us, and we are still asked to trust God, and it makes no sense to do it. It really doesn't.
No
Faith
sense.
is one of the most senseless things that our small minds, can try to grasp. Because even when the worst happens, it should paradoxically increase your trust in God's love.
Yeah.
And that is a challenge we all face.
It's true.
There's so many reasons to turn away from God.
You talked about the human propensity is to say, all right, I'm going to hold you at arm's length until you can prove that you're trustworthy. And then I'll trust you. Once your track record shows me you're trustworthy, I'll trust you.
Right.
And it's like God's invitation to us is the opposite. It's like He's saying, hey, trust me, and I'll prove that I'm trustworthy. And yet that flies sometimes in direct conflict with some of these things that we experience in life. Like, as you say, it's like, man, how can okay, God, I trusted you with my family. I trusted you with my health. I trusted you with and now this has happened. But what we find, and this is probably the pinnacle of that paradox, is that we find, as you said earlier, that God is right there in the future waiting for us. It's like Psalm 23 comes alive, where it says, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. And somehow we experience the presence of God in the midst of all of these things, that even though everything else around us doesn't make any sense, that seems to be the only thing that goes, okay, this doesn't make sense, that this makes sense.
Right.
But it makes sense.
Yes, that's a brilliant way of putting it.
Hi, friend. I wanted to take a quick minute to connect you with a free resource that I know will be helpful in your pain to purpose journey. It's our free 7-day devotional that you can sign up for right now. With it, you'll get 7 daily devotionals written by our founder, Davey Blackburn, delivered to your inbox each morning. These are adapted from our Pain to Purpose 42-day devotional and are full of daily scripture readings, questions to reflect upon, and prayer prompts to help you focus your heart. If you're looking for some encouragement in whatever you're facing, this is it, and it's free. You just have to go to devo.nothingiswasted.com to sign up. I don't know your story, but what I do know is that God isn't done with it. Whether you've endured a recent loss, a divorce, an unexpected diagnosis, or some other pain point, God wants to give you hope when it seems like it is lost. Let's take 7 days together to find that hope in whatever you're walking through. Sign up today at devo.nothingiswasted.com.
And we try to bargain with God all the time because we don't trust Him. It's like we've got. I was talking to Max Lucado the other day, and he talked about conditional prayer. Where I'll give you something, God, if you give me something back. Who are we to offer anything to God except our faith and our trust? And Max, talked about how he did it so much of his life. And in Max's case, it was his father had ALS, and he couldn't understand how God could do this to him. Not to his father, but to Max. And I found myself thinking, how could you do this to me when it was my mother's Alzheimer's? And it's like, God's not doing anything to anyone. That's what we experience as human beings are human problems, not God problems. And, it is God who's there to help us not always solve the problem, but at least cope with it, face it, and try to work our ways through it. That's what Guidepost stories are all about, is people working through their problems. It's just, it's something that unites us as human beings. We forget, we think we're alone in our struggles, but we're not. And one of the things that we do in Guideposts is, it's not so much saying God is with you in your struggles. That's axiomatic, but we're each other. We're in it. When people read Guidepost stories, they say, wow, that happened to me too, or something like I can identify with that struggle.
Yeah.
And we all struggle
Yeah.
together. And the more together we are, the more our struggles at least begin to make sense.
Wow. Wow. So good. You know, I'm curious about this. You've shared a little bit about your battle with your addiction and sobriety, and in both two different situations. One prior to going to Guideposts, and then in another stint while you were wrestling with your mom's
Yeah,
disease.
right. And
I
plus that we
wonder
call
what
it a
you've
slip.
learned. Yeah, yeah. I wonder what you've learned about healing and the brain as you've gone through that journey yourself. We talk a lot about healing, and we talk a lot about both physical healing and emotional healing, but there's so much that's coming to the forefront now in conversations, scientific discoveries about, you know, the brain, the neural pathways, and how God interacts with that, and how healing interacts with that, and how experiences. So I'm just curious about your own journey through that. There's a lot of people who are listening to this who they've wrestled through their own addictions and their own struggles through that, or they've watched a friend or a family member and they're trying to journey that road. What are your thoughts on that? What are some maybe paradigm shifts that you've experienced in your own journey?
Well, I've always been interested in the brain. So when I began the book, it was during the pandemic. So Julie and me and our dog Gracie, who's asleep right there to my left, we retreated here to this little vacation place that we had in the Berkshires, um, and I just ordered every book. When I decided I was going to write about this subject, I ordered everything I could on the brain, every book,
Mm.
and spent days and days reading books on the brain, only to realize that
Mm.
really it's an incredible. If God lives any place, it's in our consciousness, and we can't really. There isn't a satisfactory definition of what consciousness is right now.
Mm.
Neuroscientists and thinkers and philosophers are still debating it, and with the advent of artificial intelligence, it becomes even more of a question. People say, well, what happens if AI becomes conscious? You know, um, but we can't really define what consciousness is. So
Mm.
how will we know if AI becomes conscious? How will we know if AI develops a faith that's real? So we
Mm.
don't, because decide our we can't really define what makes us conscious. We can talk about the neural pathways. We can talk about the various parts of the brain that involve memory, like the hippocampus or the neocortex. Um, and what I discovered was that the brain is function. It's almost entirely a memory machine. That's what the brain is. Everything we do, all of our thinking is based on memory, however instantaneous those memories are. Even what we're seeing now in a room, that is a memory because of the time it takes for the image to actually get into your brain and to be
Yeah.
shepherded through those neural pathways to the correct place where it can be experienced. But the brain is unfathomably complex,
Mm.
and and only someone more, deeper and more complex than the brain could have created it, and that has to be a universal divinity, a God, the way Christians uh,
Yeah.
perceive him. Um, and that's why a disease that affects the brain is it so fundamentally shakes um, our foundations, in life and in
Right.
faith, because the brain is really everything. And I've been, and so and it takes healing starts in the mind always, no matter whether it's your
Mm.
broken leg or your broken heart. Um, it is the
Mm.
mind that is the healing um, dynamo, because it's so much about how you think and how your brain interprets those thoughts, um,
Mm.
and how that healing can flow through the brain and the heart. It's really it's healing is such a miraculous thing. If you've ever had a cut and you've watched it heal over time,
Mm.
it's a miracle to look at the skin come back together, and to feel that, that is God touching us, that healing. We ask why God, makes us suffer in our own small human interpretation of suffering. you know, but what God really does is heals us. He doesn't make us suffer, but He does heal, and you can see it all around. And for me, I worried a lot about when I was drinking, and particularly earlier in my life. I reached the end stages of alcoholism very quickly, and by the time I was in my late 20s, I was suffering the DTs and withdrawal seizures and grand mal convulsions and so forth. And all these years later, I began to think, well, how is that primed my brain for dementia? Has that damaged me in a way, that I'm not going to be able to fix? And it does. It hangs over me, that fear, but still, the mind is so brilliantly conceived that it really does heal itself. There's that old saying, physician, heal thyself, but really it's brain, heal thyself, because the brain can do it, and God has given us that healing power. That He, when you heal, it's a long process. Healing isn't. I want to be healed overnight. I want everything to be fixed in 24 hours. I have a definite, timer on my prayers, and healing is not an instantaneous thing. And I think we are healed. It's a cliche, but I think we are healed. We are stronger in the broken places. I believe that. And healing, suffering and healing, which are virtually the same thing in many respects, for me is the only time I've experienced profound personal and, more importantly, spiritual growth. I love being happy. I love having a good day. I don't learn much about myself or the world or my faith or God on a good day.
Yeah.
I just coast along enjoying what it feels like.
Yeah.
But my growth periods in life have been when I'm at my darkest and my suffering is the deepest and my need for healing is the greatest. It's those times in my life that I've grown spiritually, and it's those times in my life when I've experienced the presence of God most dramatically and have grown closer to Him. On a good day, I'm on great terms with God. I'm on great terms with the Lord. Nice day, thanks. But I'm not growing.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that people should go out and deliberately suffer in order to, to stimulate spiritual growth.
Encouraging
But we're
asceticism
all going to
over
suffer.
here. Yeah.
Yes. We're all going to go through periods of suffering, and we have to see them as
Right.
as opportunities for spiritual growth. And then that sounds sort of Panglossian, but it took me a long time. It took me, when I was drinking for those years, I suffered over and over and over again, and I didn't learn that that was a vehicle for me to grow. And finally, when I realized that suffering was the path to growth, I grew. I grew in spite of myself. Most of my good qualities, such as they are, have developed in spite of myself. So, and that includes growth.
Man. Yeah, it's always nice to have those days of levity, right? But you're right. It's absolutely it's a paradox that we grow in the places of suffering. We grow in the dark night of the soul more than we are
do.
going to when
and we heal there.
we're experiencing mountaintop. That's right. That's right. It's interesting too, the perspective that you just brought forward, that it's not that God puts suffering on us necessarily, which is often what we resort to. It's the mindset that we resort to, is like, God, why are you doing this to me? It's that God created our bodies to heal because He knew in this life we would be cut. He knew in this life we would be hurt. We would experience. So He already embedded inside the DNA coding of our bodies for it to heal. What a fascinating thing.
Right, and it is fascinating. That's why I said you look at a cut. It's even interesting. I cut myself a couple of years ago. It was a bad cut, and I kept taking pictures of it with my phone. As it got better. Because I was sending them to my doctor because he wanted to know how it was healing. But I was amazed to look at those pictures and see it got better. It healed the skin, the cells. They regenerated, and you're right. It's right in our DNA that we're programmed to heal. And I think it's in our spiritual DNA as well that we are programmed to heal. And it's not
Yeah.
always easy. We can't always find our way immediately, but we are programmed for healing. That is how God created us. He created the universe. He created a broken world, or at least a broken
Right.
world came into being, and
Right.
it's a world that can be healed. Suffering began in the Garden of Eden with a choice. That's where suffering began, and it's been part of our existence ever since. But an important part.
Wow.
And you hate to tell people that they should be grateful for their problems.
Mm.
I don't know, grateful is the word for it, but I think acceptance is probably a better word than gratitude for that.
Mm. Yeah, that's
When you
probably true.
accept your suffering, you begin to get past it. And I'm not saying that everyone should exist in a state of suffering. I certainly don't. But those
Yeah.
the tragedies in life are
Yeah.
ways to find your way closer to God. And
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
been my blessing.
Yeah. I feel like in the middle of my healing, the Lord was really nudging me to think about contentment. Paul talks about in Scripture that he's found contentment in every season. So whether it is some of these seasons of levity or these seasons of mountaintop experiences, but also in the seasons of suffering, how do we find contentment? And I think acceptance is a very big component of finding that, to say, okay, that's part of that trust journey that we have with the Lord as well. It's like, all right, I'm content in this. I don't know if I like it, but I'm
No,
content, and
I
those two
think
things
you're
can coexist.
Davey, I think you're completely right about that. It's a beautiful point that really contentment is wholly dependent on acceptance. You know, and you don't have to accept necessarily the things that are bad for you, but if you accept the day that God has given you, you're more likely to be contented in it, and then fighting against it. It's hard to be content contentful if you're always fighting. I found myself fighting a lot when
Mm.
I was younger. So I was fighting about something, usually with
Mm.
myself, but often with others, and frequently with God. I really didn't.
Wow.
I was raised in a very Christian home, and I was an altar boy for a long time. But I drifted from that faith quite a bit until I found my way back. And finding my way, I did not run into the arms of God. I did everything I did to run away from the arms of God. And I think I just, he was always waiting around whatever corner I was turning.
Mm.
And eventually, I ran out of energy.
Mm. Man, wow. Edward, I've got two more questions, and one of them, is just a very practical question. I know there are people who listen to this, and they found themselves in a season where they're a caretaker for a family member, parents. What's practical advice that you would give to someone who is watching a family member suffer, wanting to step in and take care of that family member, be there for that family member or friend? Anything that you would, if you were sitting across the table and having coffee with them, anything that you would suggest to them or recommend?
Well, first and foremost, take care of yourself. There's
Mm.
it's my late wife used to call it the oxygen mask theory.
Mm.
You're on an airplane, and they always tell you before you try to help others, put your oxygen mask on first, and then you can help
Mm.
others. Caregiving's a lot like that. You have to make sure, that your spiritual, your physical and mental and emotional needs are being taken care of enough so that you are strong enough to help the loved one you're caring for. And,
Mm.
I think, secondly, don't blame yourself. It's so easy to blame yourself for not doing enough or for your loved one's condition or suffering. You've got to step out of that circle of blame, because you can't effectively care for someone if you're not being good to yourself. And that's you have to be good to yourself to be good to others, and that is really the key to caretaking. And I'd say give yourself breaks, give yourself days off. Don't be afraid. Don't ever be afraid to ask others to help you. I meet people who's, they're taking care of a parent, for instance, who's very sick, and they have brothers and sisters that could help them, but they're afraid to ask, or they don't, and sometimes they want to do it all, and as a caretaker, you cannot do it all, and you probably can't cure the person you're caring for. That's up to the doctors and to God. Um, And the final thing, and this is more specific to Alzheimer's, be there in the moment. One of the lessons of this book was to be present in the moment. Do not try to be present in any other way. Live in the moment. So, and Alzheimer's patients do live in the moment. If they go off on some fantastical experience they thought they had, if they're detached from reality, go with them. Don't correct the person with Alzheimer's who keeps forgetting something. That's going to happen. I mean, it's trying to correct. It's trying to correct someone who has a tumor, and saying, your tumor shouldn't be growing. The person with the disease can't control that. And so if you stick with your, I found with my mom, it was just, if she said something off the wall, I accepted it as how she was experiencing reality at that moment, and I would try to experience it with her, rather than to fight for her against fighting a battle that she's not going to win. I'm certainly not going to win. The big lessons of the book, A Journey of Faith, the big lessons of the book were Alzheimer's destroys everything except love. The last word my mother spoke to me after she hadn't spoken for a long time, and I was with her, and she was close to death, and I felt compelled. I said, it's a terrible thing to do, to unburden yourself on someone who's dying in front of your eyes. But I apologized for all of the terrible things I put her through. And I was not an easy kid, and and I told her, no matter what, I always loved her, and I knew she loved me. And suddenly she spoke one last word, and that was the word love. And I think that Alzheimer's cannot destroy love, because it's not just a function of our bodies to love, even though love is physical. We think about love all the time. We think about it a lot, but love is a state of being. We love the scent of a rose, but the scent is not the rose itself, and love is not what we think of it or how we experience it, which is emotionally. It is a state of being. It is indestructible, I think, as is faith, since faith is based in love. And my mother's faith, at the end, she could still say her prayers very close to the end. She could still remember hymns. She could forget everything else, but if she always showed up for the prayer group at her memory care, and she remembered Bible verses, she remembered hymns. It was amazing, because that was like the one thing that Alzheimer's couldn't destroy. Faith exists outside of the brain, in that state of consciousness that doesn't get destroyed by Alzheimer's. So, so those are the real journey. That's where I learned. That's where I ended up. That you live in the present, because that's where faith and love are, and faith and love are not. They're indestructible.
Hey, it's Aubrey Sampson here, and just like you, I have dealt with a lot of big feelings and heartache in my life. Mostly I've written about lament and grief for a grown-up audience, but we all know, especially here at Nothing is Wasted, that adults do not have a monopoly on strong, difficult emotions. And so I have turned my attention to writing about big feelings for little ones with a brand new children's book called Big Feelings Days, a book about hard things, heavy emotions, and Jesus' love. We all know that children have a lot of emotions, and feeling sad or angry or brokenhearted can be overwhelming. That's why it's so important to help the kids in our lives understand that their feelings are valuable and normal, and that they can creatively express what they feel to Jesus, who created emotions and deeply cares about everyone. Big Feelings Days is a tender and engaging picture book that helps children ages 3 to 7 learn how to release their feelings of grief, anger, and heartbreak in creative ways to our God who cares. This picture book includes full-color illustrations, and they are darling. Relatable imagery to help children express and identify emotions, and creative ways for children to process their feelings with Jesus. Even now, you can be helping your kids develop emotional health, or your grandkids, or your nieces and nephews. Those kids you love, you can help them begin to develop emotional health and emotional intelligence as they learn to come to Jesus with whatever they may be feeling. And a little secret between us, this book helps adults as well. You can pre-order it wherever it is you pre-order your book. It comes out on October 17th. If you go to navpress.com, you'll find the book for 20% off for our Nothing is Wasted listeners. You can also follow me at obsamp on Instagram for more information.
Wow. Man. Edward, I almost don't want to ask you this question. One, because I know it's very fresh in your life. I know you've talked, you've written about it, you've been open about it. But also, I feel like we're closing one story loop and opening up another one right now. But you've recently just experienced the loss of your wife, Julie, just over a year ago, lost by suicide. And
Right.
I know that there are a lot of people listening to this, and they've experienced that as well. And that's
Right. Well,
such a difficult loss to wrestle through.
Yes, and I heard about it a lot, and I never thought it would happen to me, really. I mean, even though Julie, she did talk about it. And then Julie, I met her, we both struggled with addiction. That's how we met, in a 12-step group so many years ago. Or one of the places we met before that, but then we sort of recognized each other in a 12-step group. And she struggled with addiction as well throughout most of her life, on and off. And she also had a disease called lupus, which was taking, a real toll on her. And she talked about ending her life. And not in that kind of wild, impulsive way, but she talked about it in a way that she had come to peace some way with God for that. None of that really mitigates the actual shock of having it happen to you. And, the words is so weird, human beings are weird. Because one of the first feelings I had when Julie did take her life was shame. And you can't have that. Shame is so destructive. It's one of the most destructive feelings we have, but we're so accustomed to it, and so it's such a default position for human beings, at least for me. I felt shame, and it was interesting. The next day, the day after she died, the New York Times called. They wanted to write the lead obituary on Julie. Julie was a singer and an actress, and had a very interesting career. So, and the New York Times said, we read that she had suffered from lupus. She had said on her website that she felt that she was at the end stages of lupus and was beginning to have a hard time walking and so forth. And the writer for the Times said, was that her cause of death? And I paused for a long time, and I thought, no, really, it wasn't. She didn't, and I said to him, no, she took her life. She hanged herself. And he said, well, we don't have to put that in the obituary. And I thought, so many people read the New York Times obituaries because they're very, they can be very moving. I read the obituaries not to find out who died, but to find out who lived. And I thought, Julie's brother had committed suicide almost to the day that 10 years before she did. And there were a number of suicides in her family. It does run in families, or can run in families. And I thought how upset she was when, in her brother's small-town obituary back in Iowa, they didn't mention his cause of death. There was like shame around that. And so I said to the obit writer for the Times, no, I want you to say that she died by her own hand, because there are so many families and people suffering from that shame, suicide is the end product of a disease as much as any other form of death that's caused by disease. In Julie's case, it was a lifelong struggle with depression, her worsening lupus. And I want to believe that she had made peace with God before she made that decision. I really have to believe. I have to believe that. It's not a decision I could make for myself, but I'm not in that position either. So who am I to say I wouldn't do that? Who are any of us to say that or to judge that? And it's hard not to judge it. It's hard not to blame yourself for it. As a like a secondary survival of suicide, I reacted like, how could you do this to me? How could you deprive me of, we'd been married for like 37 years. And who is she to make the decision to end it like that? But those questions for me, I mean, have been like, no, this is something, this was between Julie and God, and your acceptance of it or your healing from it is between you and God. But blaming Julie, blaming myself, it just got me stuck for a while in a really uncomfortable place spiritually and emotionally. And I had that just sort of said, like, I'm going to heal from this, but it's not going to be on my time schedule, and it's not going to be easy, and I simply have to believe in that universal power of God's healing presence in all of our lives. And I have to believe that Julie is with God. I have to believe that was a decision she made based on prayer, and it's one of the great taboos of human existence, suicide, but it happened, and my job isn't to go back and try to explain it or change it. My job is to accept that it happened, and accept my feelings as a result, process the guilt and the shame, process it through the system, or as it gets stuck. Grief, I've found, particularly since Julie's death, and I don't want to hurt anyone's feelings, but grief can be the most selfish state. Grief can be incredibly and it almost by definition has to be selfish, because what you're really suffering is your own pain, and not the other person. That you miss the other person, but the real, feelings you're having for yourself and your sense of loss, and that's natural. Even if it's self-centered, it's still the natural feeling to think about what that absence, that sense of loss means to you, that hole that has been left by that person's death, however they die. And you process those feelings. I mean, that's why I say it's sort of a self-centered, even selfish thing, because you have to process all that through, or you get stuck in grief. We've all known people who simply never got over their grief, because I think because they got stuck in it, and they got trapped in it. And, I don't think that's what Julie would have wanted for me. And she always said, she made jokes about suicide. It was hard not to talk about it because it permeated her family in so many ways. But she always said to me, and I always sort of like, I did not blow her off, but I always sort of pushed the discussion aside. She'd say, if I ever decide to end my life, I want you to know it's not you or anybody else's fault. It's a decision I've made, and that I'm at peace with it. So I remember those words, and I know that ultimately I'm supposed to be at peace, and that Julie's suffering from the lupus and the pain physical pain that she was in, and was getting worse, and was intractable and pretty much untreatable. The emotional pain and depression, she'd had a really difficult childhood and had never completely healed from that. I have to realize that she's been freed of all that, however she chose to get free of it. And it goes back to that question of acceptance. Unless we accept the reality of what occurs in our lives, you can't move on from that. There are so many traps along the way, and those traps are there because of our acceptance. To get back to the question of trust, you unless you trust, you can't accept. Unless you trust God, then that act of acceptance is very, very difficult, because it's a blind act, and that's really scary. So I'm still healing from that process. I wish I could be more coherent about it, but I'm not, and that's okay that I'm incoherent when it comes to Julie's suicide.
That's absolutely okay and perfectly acceptable. I think that's even some of the beauty, Edward, as you were sitting here talking about that, processing out loud. I think earlier you talked about this, this idea of telling writers that they need to be honest, and that somehow in the honesty we can all find ourselves in that. And
Right.
somehow, as odd as this may sound, even in your wrestling right there, it's providing a lot of comfort for those of us who are listening to you wrestle, because you're coming to a place where you're taking some of the things that don't seem to reconcile in your own heart and your own head, and you're holding them out, and you're willing to embrace the two of them together, even though they seem completely contrary. And there's something about that that really points us then to this whole idea of trust, that there is something bigger outside of us, beyond us, a higher power. We know his name is Jesus, and that he can hold all of that, and that eventually all of that can be mended and can be healed. May not be on this side of eternity, but that
Right.
he has an answer to all. He is the answer to all of that.
He is the
And,
plan. I
That's
mean,
right.
there's a plan. There's a divine plan for us as individuals and as Christians and as the human race. And Christ was part of it, coming into our world for 33 years and showing us the light. But the plan is still in action. I mean, we're still moving forward through
Right.
God's future and through the Lord's future. And, you don't know where the plan is taking you. You know that the end is redemption and joy. But it's
Right.
it's the journey right now that we're on, and that's what that prepares us for that.
Wow.
And we need to
Well,
be
Edward, man, I
prepared
wish
because we are imperfect.
we do. That's right. That's right. And one day, I believe wholeheartedly, we're going to look back and we're going to see all the meaning and purpose that has come of our lives. And I'm not saying that we have necessarily reason or explanation. It's not like it's going to 1 + 1 = 2 and it's going to make everything kind of nullified. It's like, oh, that was worth it. I don't know if that's necessarily going to be the case, but there's going to be this just sense of contentment and meaning and beauty within all of it that we're going to be able to. It's going to encapsulate our lives, even and as you've pointed out, especially in the valleys that we go through, the difficult
Right.
things that we
Right.
experience.
Yeah.
And I just appreciate you being extremely honest with us today, and
Well,
opening
thank
up your
you for the
heart
opportunity.
and giving us so much
I mean,
time, man.
Oh, that's fine. I mean, to give me this opportunity to talk is also to give me an opportunity to continue on my own journey of healing.
Yeah, that's right.
So this is as much, for me as for anyone else. And I say that knowing that it might sound selfish, but healing can be selfish.
Yeah.
In the
it's so
sense that
good.
we need to draw in all of the energy we can draw in, all the love, that indestructible force. We need to gather it and draw it in so that we can heal. And this is part of the healing. This time I spent with you.
Wow. Well, thank you, Edward. I want to make sure that everybody who's watching this on YouTube or listening to this, you guys pick up a copy of A Journey of Faith, especially if you want to hear more from Edward and his stories.
Right.
Subtitle, A Mother's Alzheimer's, A Son's Love and His Search for Answers. And then the other books that Edward has put out. This is just really, what I appreciate about you is that you're really thinking deeply and honestly about these things. And like you said, a lot of Christian writers, that we kind of put out really pithy theological concepts and very trite phrases. And I'm just really appreciative of the deep wrestling that you're doing and that you're inviting us into, to wrestle in our own pain. And so I know that your book is going to do that even further for us.
If it helps one person, it'll justify writing it. And you can get your book at shop Guideposts, one word, .org. And there are 2 free gifts that come with the book if you order it to Guideposts. One is a video collection of little anecdotes that I've told about, 90-second. There's 10 of them. And you also get a new book of my a new pamphlet of my devotions, which I write. I've been writing for a long time. Or you can just get the book through Amazon.
That's awesome.
But you don't get the free
That's awesome.
premiums for that.
That's right. We'll put a link right there. We'll make sure that we link the Guidepost link right here under this YouTube video, as well as on the show notes for all the podcast platforms.
Great.
So make sure you follow that. Get the free premium offers there. But Edward, thank you so much for spending time with us, man. This has just been incredible.
Thank you, Davey. I really, really appreciate it. And God bless you for what you're doing. And I want to pray. I definitely will pray. I'll put on my prayer list the woman, because I can't get her out of my head, that woman who called you about her early onset Alzheimer's. I will pray for her.
Yeah, for sure. Well, Amy, what'd you think? It's a great conversation, huh?
It was, and he was so vulnerable, and so especially there at the end, talking about his wife that's so fresh, with losing his wife. I think he said about a year ago, and so and just I love that he was willing to go in places that we need to hear about it, and even him talking about the power of story, and it makes sense that he would be somewhere like Guideposts that champions that and sees the benefit and the power of it. But he did talk a lot about where healing begins, and in the mind particularly. And I couldn't help but think of the verse in Romans 12 where it talks about the renewing of your mind, and verse like 2 Corinthians 10 where it talks about taking every thought captive. And especially as a mom, like I think about what's going in my kids' minds, but even my own mind, it's like, am I doing something intentional where it's going to lead to healing and hope and releasing the trauma and those kinds of things. So that's where I was kind of the things I pulled away from the episode.
That's right. It's amazing to me just how impactful the battle in your mind is on every aspect of your life.
So true.
Every aspect of your life. I mean, we talk about it so much in the Pain to Purpose course. We bring up that Romans 12 verse right there, that this is probably one of the most direct references to neuropsychology, right? Where he's talking about this idea of renewing the mind. And what we've discovered now is that there is actually rewriting in your neural pathways that has to take place after you've experienced trauma, that there is some embedded, quite literally, it's embedded trauma. It actually produces certain grooves that create mindsets or false beliefs in our psyche. And what's really fascinating, I've mentioned this book before, Amy. I think it's a great reference for people, but Timothy Jennings wrote a book called The God-Shaped Brain.
Okay.
And he talks about that when people encounter the God of the Bible, right? Like the true God for who he really is, as we're discovering more and more the love of God particularly, and what it does to heal our trauma, but also how it actually physically rewrites the neural pathways in our brain.
It's amazing.
And so he's studied this as a neuropsychologist and counselor as he helps to unravel and kind of, in some ways, deconstruct people's preconceived notions of God and then reconstruct it with the biblical view of the Bible, or the biblical view of God.
Yeah.
Then he's seeing people be healed
Yes.
from a lot of mental ailments especially. And so it's just a fascinating thing that Scripture really speaks to that. But we talk quite a bit about this. What you focus on in life, Philippians 4:8, whatever is true, whatever is noble, what you focus on, you're going to find. That's the thing that you're going to, I know this when it comes to, anybody who's married, you can, or with your kids, or when you're around the same people all the time under one roof, you can focus on all the negative things that they do. And you're going to constantly discover those negative things. You're going to build a case of evidence toward those negative things, if you've created this narrative in your mind. But if you focus on the good attributes, the positive things, those things tend to grow. It's amazing what happens right here in between our ears and how it impacts every area of our life.
It affects too, if you think about it, if you hear about, from your childhood, someone has said something about you and it sticks with you, and then you hear it, it's reinforced throughout your life. That's a kind of a groove in your brain of this is who you are. And so then you're living that out of well, I'm a failure. I can't achieve. I'm this, I'm that. And so it takes I guess the language is rewiring, rewriting, but it really is that removal of the lie and replacing it with truth, right? And so we can talk about it in a neuroscience way that it goes right along with what God wants to do. If you can call it like, we can go to therapy, we can go to counseling, we can do the Pain to Purpose course, we can find a coach, all of those things. But the point is that we are removing the lies that we believe about ourselves, about ourselves, about the Lord, about our community, to then put in what is true. And then it's going to affect how we respond next time something hits our life. And
That's
so,
right.
yeah.
I love the, just that basic psychology of, we call it the ABCs of emotions, right? There's an activating event that creates a consequent emotion. That's your A and that's your C. But what happens in between those two things is that activating event embeds some kind of a belief inside of you.
Totally.
And we often try to attack or address the A or the C. So we try to change our environment or our, the things that are going on around us, so we don't have the activating event. The problem with that is you're gonna feel triggered, so to speak. You're gonna have some kind of an activation. So you can't hedge yourself from that always, right? And then you've got these consequent emotions, and so people will try to deal with the emotions by numbing or building, maladaptive coping mechanisms, that's not the pathway to a healthy and whole life either, right?
No.
And so we have to address exactly what you're saying. We have to address the beliefs.
Yes.
It's the beliefs by which everything that we take in, that we observe or that we absorb in life, it's through the beliefs then that everything is kind of how we interact and interface then with life from there.
Totally.
So we've got to understand what it looks like to experience that kind of healing first in the mind, and then it's going to impact everything else. And there is definitely evidence, Amy, of even physical healing that comes out of that kind of is manifested out of a mental, emotional, and spiritual healing.
Yeah.
The correlation. I've seen a study before, and I can't off the top of my head. I don't have that data in front of me. But the correlation between, physical ailments that correlate with that are congruent with, for instance, harboring bitterness and resentment. Mm-hmm. It's amazing what happens when you harbor those kinds of, and you're not addressing those kinds of internal beliefs or internal emotional fragmentations. What it does to your body.
Yeah. I don't know if you've heard about this before. I'm with a lot of moms of child loss. That's kind of my world, with wanting to help that population because it's my own story. And I've even heard of people like literally being diagnosed with like broken heart syndrome.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've ever heard of that.
Yes.
And I believe it's true. Like because that season right after losing our son, I definitely walked through the traditional, like everyone describes it as grief brain and lack of energy, and the weight of grief is so heavy that it affects you physically. And again, the whole idea of the body keeps the score.
Yeah.
But even that idea of the broken heart syndrome, is not just an emotional thing you're walking through. It literally is affecting like your blood pressure, and like it literally has physical connections. And so we're all one being, right? Body, spirit, mind. Right. And so I just appreciated that Edward kind of led us in that conversation of talking about the healing of the mind, and then the mind doing its work through us, and changing our belief system to believe truth about who we are.
Right.
Yeah.
As we kind of close the conversation, my final thought on the conversation with Edward, and this is a little bit of a pivot, but I referenced it earlier that it was a very sobering conversation. Edward was, you could see him almost visibly wrestling with mortality.
Yeah. Oh.
And I think that's natural with, he helped his mom navigate this disease and recently lost his wife. And now he himself is, he admits there's signs that he's seeing of like, am I prone to this same disease? I feel like I'm not. I feel like my mind's slipping sometimes, that kind of thing. And so he's wrestling with that. It's a very deep wrestling for him. And I don't know if I necessarily have very well thought out application here on this, but I do think there is something that is very good for all of us to wrestle with that. To just be reminded of the fact that life is a vapor.
Yes.
That we are here for a moment and then we are gone. Mm-hmm. And that this is not our final resting place. Mm-hmm. And the things that we're doing, the things that we're building, the things that we're investing in here, we have to ask the question, is it going to carry over into what's next? Mm-hmm. Because what's next is exceedingly greater, so much longer. This is just a blip on the radar. Right. I find myself slipping so much into being tied to the things of this world, tethered to earth, that I forget. So easy to. Mm-hmm. But having that wrestling, going, you know what, and you and I have both, when you lose somebody, you losing Hudson, me losing Amanda, that you're so, it's like there's a very thin line, a thin veil between heaven and earth.
Yes.
And there's something bittersweet about that. I hate the fact that for us as human beings, it often takes that kind of loss to really transport us to that place. Mm-hmm. But I love having that taste.
Yeah.
And then having the expectation and anticipation, of I can't wait for that day. I can't wait for that day. And I've had to wrestle with that a lot. Go ahead.
Yeah. No, I was just saying, I was speaking with a sweet mama who's lost her sweet boy, Brooks, recently. And we were talking about that. And I was like, I feel like some of the things I say to you can feel trite. It can feel like, heaven and he's whole and he's not hurting. But it's real. Heaven is more real than what we are experiencing here. But we think we're so smart that we think what we can touch and feel is what is real. And even just the concept of faith, of saying it will be sight, and it is sight for those that we've loved who have gone before us. So it isn't trite to really dwell there and really think about that is what is next, and it is eternal. It is eternal. So
yeah. Well, this coming Sunday, the release of this is going to be released on the 9th. This coming Sunday, I'm preaching at one of our partner churches, United, on heaven.
Oh, wow.
So we'll make sure that I'll let you know about that. Follow us on Instagram. Follow me on Instagram, and we'll try to point you in the direction of where you could listen to that.
Awesome.
But I've been thinking about that a lot recently as I'm kind of preparing the run up to that message, Amy. And I think this conversation was really helpful just to get into that headspace too and think about it. So I hope you enjoyed this conversation too, guys. Whether you're watching this on YouTube or you're listening to this on one of your podcast platforms, we'd love for you to rate and review. Apple Podcasts does a great job of providing a rating system where, as you give it a good rating, it begins to gain more exposure to other people so they can hear these incredible stories. And so we'd love to invite you to do that. Subscribe on YouTube so you don't miss any content, but also share it. Share these conversations and get it out there so that other people can hear this. And we want to invite you to follow us on Instagram at Nothing Is Wasted Ministries. Speaking of Amy being kind of a utility player for our team, she also does a whole lot of stuff on Instagram and helping to manage a lot of that. And you're like, what did somebody said the other day, Amy, you're the utility knife or the Swiss Army knife.
I like it.
The Swiss Army knife for our ministry. It's amazing. You're so multi-talented. And so follow us there at Nothing Is Wasted Ministries. You can follow me at Davey Blackburn. You can follow Amy on Instagram. Amy, where can we follow you?
I think the best place is at This Wholehearted Life, and it has an underscore. It's the best place.
At This Wholehearted Life with an underscore. And then we want to thank Sleeping at Last for providing all the music for the Nothing Is Wasted podcast. You can listen or download his music anywhere music can be streamed and downloaded. Remember, 5 steps to taking back your story. If you want to join us on that call, nothingiswasted.com/start here. Next week, we've got a great conversation. Actually, Eric Shoemaker has a conversation with. Don't you love the fact that we've got a lot of different people?
It's awesome.
Doing interviews and different voices, and I think it's just really fun to have a whole group of people doing this. But Eric has a conversation with Doug McKelvey and Ned Bustard. And I have just recently been given a work that Doug did. I'm not gonna spoil it. We'll talk about it more next week. But here's a little clip from Eric's conversation with Doug and Ned.
It's amazing how the work that we create, ends up serving others, but then can minister to us as well. While my wife was in the hospital, and in hospice, we were able to use Every Moment Holy too to provide words when we didn't have words. When you're in the middle of grief and suffering, it's hard to know what to pray. Many times you don't even know if you can or should pray. You know that to reach out to God is a hard thing, and so Doug's prayers allowed us, not allowed us, gave us those gifts. He prayed for us, and then we were able to take those prayers and use them. This past June was my 33rd anniversary, and I was able to take the prayer for removing your wedding ring and use that, because how do you celebrate your anniversary when your wife is not there? I was struggling with that, and because of my artwork being so symbolic, people were like, "Oh, you don't have to take your ring off." I was like, "Well, the ring is a symbol for being married, and that's not my privilege anymore." So I was able to take that. I had some friends and I had my family, my girls, and friends from church, and we went to church, and we just basically just prayed that one prayer. I think I prayed the prayer for loss of a spouse as well, and it was one of those things that you realize that this is what this is for. We're making these books to create, help people create these sacred spaces, to set aside these moments as holy. They are holy, but often we don't know what to do or how to mark them.
Hey friend, if you liked this episode, be sure to like and subscribe so that you can stay in the loop every time Nothing is Wasted releases a piece of content here on this YouTube channel.